What is going on, guys, and welcome back. It is the era of counter decks in Marvel Snap. Why is everybody playing them and why you should be as well? How do you identify what deck your opponent is playing by the first 2 turns and the importance of the early game in Marvel Snap? And then lastly, what are the most important cards in each archetype, the MVPs, if you will? We're going to talk about all that and more on today's episode of the Snapchat. And I'm joined again by Mr. Alex on this post-Valentine's Day. How's your February been with the game? How's the new season going, climbing?
It's been going great. And honestly, I've been really trying to kind of refocus my energy on being a better player. My February thus far has been kind of like an attempt and a realistic approach to improving my personal game. And it's been successful. I'm higher ranked than I traditionally am at this point of the season. I maxed out last season at my highest rank. I got into the 90s and
let's go.
Pushed infinite this year. So anyways, it's always progress and I love to see it. And, I'm hoping to continue to push myself further and further.
So what deck are you currently climbing with right now? What are you playing with at the moment?
At the moment, I've been playing a lot of, believe it or not, Sarah Surfer. So it's one of those kind of surprise gotcha. It's still Surfer list. And it's been super successful because a lot of people really underestimate and just don't expect it. So that's what I've been climbing with a lot lately. I've also been experimenting with some tournament style decks, right? Which are pretty interesting because, when you approach a tournament style deck, you're building a deck that's completely different than a standard meta matchmaking deck because you're going to be facing the same person over and over again.
Yeah, I noticed. So it's funny. I noticed week 1 of the new season, we had MODOK and discard was kind of everywhere. And now as I climb, I still see it a lot. I'm seeing a lot of discard, but it's starting to die down. People are kind of going back to their other decks. And that's kind of where we're going to start with today's subjects. Over here, you guys know what we're talking about. And on Alex's side, quickly, what are we going to be talking about over there?
We're going to be talking about the meta snapshot. We're going to have a discussion about, how the meta has evolved since the patch changes to Zabu and Silver Surfer and what it looks like this week. We're also talking about Marvel Snap's monetization model and how it has been changed over the last little while. Bundles have changed, the value of bundles has changed, and we're going to have a little discussion about what we see going on in the future and what perhaps we see, moving forward with the bundles and monetization. Further, we're going to talk about cards that are being slept on, good cards that people just don't play that we think could really catch people by surprise and overall provide you with a lot of value in the game.
So let's talk about the first subject, Alex, the era of counter decks. Right now, counter decks are kind of all over, and counter decks have been around since their early beta. They've been a reliable option to take up to infinite, and people are starting to finally catch on to them. I think they teach a lot of valuable ways and practices in Snap. Kind of teaches you to be defensive and anticipate what your opponent is going to do. But when everybody's playing these kind of counter control decks, then it kind of defeats the purpose. Now, a lot of people are kind of leaning to these right now because of the meta's kind of all over the place, and what is good are these top-end power cards like Shuri, and, we have the Deathway that's doing really well. Alex, do you find yourself playing control and counter decks a lot?
Honestly, I don't actually find myself playing control and counter decks all that often.
Okay.
I know that it's one of those things that, I probably should add to my repertoire more often than not. I know that you have an absolutely incredible Sarah control list, and I know you're a huge fan of control. But what I often find myself doing is adding control pieces into my deck list. It might sound obvious, but when the meta's hot around on reveal, you add a Cosmo, you add a Shang-Chi or whatever it is. You add pieces. For instance, a couple weeks ago when Morbius was running absolutely wild, the rogues and the enchantresses, and I feel like countering is a very proactive approach to the game. While it's defensive, I think that adding the right pieces to kind of give yourself tools against the meta is so important. And it's funny because even with just adding one counter card, but Shang-Chi is still a 4 cost, so it is a commitment still to play it on a turn, but obviously its impact can be wild, absolutely wild, right? So I often find myself adding pieces as opposed to playing an entire list, which I know you're a fan of.
Yeah, no, honestly, I think that's a good subject to bring up because I find people, they like the Sarah control list. It's one of the most popular decks at the moment, Alex. A lot of people are playing it by just what I can see on YouTube and just going out there and playing. And the thing about Sarah control that people need to know is that it was so great for so long because people weren't anticipating a lot of what was going on with Bishop. Here's the deck list right here, guys. You can see kind of everything in the deck. We've talked about it a good amount, but this is kind of your staple counter deck, and so this is what people are used to at the moment. However, Alex brought up a good point, and I kind of want to talk about it as well. I have now shifted, Alex, to much more of a control style, and we can bring up the deck right here. For those that don't know, I'll read it out here. But a much more control style of a counter deck. Now, why this is important is with Sarah control, people were kind of reading my moves. And in fact, I played somebody with this deck on a video the other day. In the first match, I went up against a Sarah control deck, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. I had a big Sunspot up to 10 power. I knew he had a Nova on the board. Kind of obvious what he's going to try to do, get rid of my Sunspot. And so Sarah Control is losing a little bit of its magic touch because although it's a very good deck with a great package, people can read it. And with counter decks, you want to have all the counter tools, but you also want to remain surprising, Alex. So this is the new deck I've been playing. It's Sunspot, Daredevil. It does have Silver Surfer, that is optional. Storm, Cosmo, Juggernaut, Kingpin, Polaris, Professor X, Arrow, She-Hulk, and Magneto. Dude, I love homebrew decks. I think there are a lot of great decks out there. Yeah. This baby just built late at night while watching some shows with my wife, tested it out, and this has been my staple option, no question about it. And the thing is, if you look at it, and it's kind of like Sarah Control, there's a lot of different interactions and packages and win conditions and ways to counter, and that's what makes it big. So Daredevil, I think, is just in a stupid good place right now. Turn 5, you know, if you have priority and they're trying to play wave on 5, you throw Cosmo down on top of the wave, and they just played a 3-drop worth nothing at that point. There's ways you could Cosmo their MODOK. Juggernaut, I'll be talking about later on Alex's side, but I think he's extremely underrated, huge for displacement. Obviously, Arrow, the best card in the game. But then at the same time, I have things like Polaris and Magneto to counter anything with my Kingpin, which is kind of where the deck is based around. And then finally, if all of that fails, Alex, we have 2 other options. I have a Silver Surfer package that they're not expecting. It looks like a control deck. Or you go with the Sunspot combo, skip turn 5, and play Arrow and She-Hulk together. So I've got like 5 different win conditions. And I think not only in battle mode, but also on the ladder, or vice versa, these decks that have a bunch of things going on, they're way harder to play. They're definitely not a kind of relax and play snappy. Kind of have to focus, but they slap, man. And this is what I'm taking to Infinite confidently this season.
The deck list looks incredible, and I really, really love the Kingpin package here. I think it's one of the most underplayed cards in the game. In fact, I'm going to have to scratch it off my It's a Sleeper list that we're going to talk about on my third topic, because I think Kingpin is a sleeper, and it's one of the cards that people aren't relying on. And what's crazy about Kingpin in this list is, like, you can destroy something with Polaris. You can destroy something with Arrow on turn 6. You can destroy tons of stuff with Magneto. You got so many options, but you know what else is awesome? The risk of being able to destroy things. So that idea that you have that threat on the board, heck, you can even destroy things with Juggernaut in that. You Juggernaut something, they get knocked into the Kingpin lane. Beautiful.
People need board space right now. Mr. Negative needs board space. These different decks outside of discard need board space. And so I shut down something early with Storm, who's still one of the best cards in the game. Control that completely. I can Silver Surfer boost it if I need to. Whatever they end up playing there, I can either Juggernaut the turn after, or I just drag it on over with my Polaris, Bucky Barnes, 2 cost, take it on over to my Kingpin lane. So I've got that option. But then this deck kind of relies around how you play Kingpin as a card. Kingpin is what runs the deck, and learning how to play him is why he's so underrated. Very hard card to play and master. But I just Juggernaut him on turn 4 because a good snap player is going to fill a Kingpin lane early. But instead of using Kingpin to kill, which I do sometimes, I do it to continue to clear the lane that is Kingpin. And so really, really great synergy. All these cards synchronized together a ton. And again, this is just a style of control and countering deck that you guys can make. Just look at different packages. Look at what cards you have and see, you know, Devil Dinosaur, great, another option that you can have a control deck, but then you have some power play if you need to. And I think that's what succeeds in counter decks.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to warn people of, though, is that, like, with counter decks and generally trying to counter in general, I think you kind of touched on it before, too. It's not all about just stuffing as many counter cards as you can. Like, you're not making a counter card tech deck. Like, that's not what this is. Right. The idea of, like, having every possible answer doesn't make sense. It's about splashing the right tools in a competent deck list that has a job and it performs it well. Yep. And that kind of gives you the opportunity to be reactive in specific situations. So, you know.
Alex, the thing I think people don't understand is counter decks, because, man, I always crack up at this. Both of my counter deck videos that I have 2 types of comments. This took me to Infinite. This is the best deck I've ever played. And then the other half is, I lost 10 games in a row. I hate this deck. This sucks. Counter decks are time commitments. You have to learn how to play them, because once you learn how to play them and how to react to every deck you're going against, that's when you do well and it's on autopilot. But they're not play big cards, play good value cards, play big red Dino T-Rex. You have to think a lot about what you're doing, and so that is the con to them. but they're worth the investment altogether. And definitely, Alex, I agree. I think that it's definitely worth taking the time to learn it. But more importantly than that, guys, is what's doing hot right now, right? What's the meta? What's doing well? And then forming a counter deck that kind of goes against that is also, important. Alex, let's go ahead and talk about our second subject today, though, identifying opponents' decks. And I think there's a great synergy, if you will, between 1 and 2 of our topics here, because identifying these decks early is how you can do very well and find success in counter decks, but also in Marvel Snap. I think after watching some of my own battle games myself, I think one of the things that I've learned and one of the most useful things under my Marvel Snap tool belt is typically I almost always know what my opponent is trying to do by turn 3, definitely, and even by turn 2. Alex, is this something that as you've been practicing as a player that you've noticed that, you kind of do subconsciously?
Absolutely. It's probably one of the biggest skills in Marvel Snap, being able to identify what your opponent's playing and then play your own cards proactively in anticipation of what they're going to play. I know that sounds like a really weird sentence, but it makes perfect sense when you consider that, like, if you know what deck that they're playing, you're going to play your cards in a very specific pattern to counter that play. You got to use locations to your advantage. You might know that certain locations are disadvantages to them, and so, you use that to your advantage. And it's funny because, like, some people that just, like, if you just net deck nonstop, then your play pattern is going to be very easily identifiable within the first 2 turns, right? And we've talked about this before, Cozy. People that bring really, truly unique decks that they've designed on their own, that they've been practicing and refining. When I play against them, even when I'm on stream, I'm like, guys, I don't know what this deck is, and I don't know how to respond. Like, it's an advantage for the player I'm against because I don't know how to read their pattern of play. So I do think you're onto something, Cozy, 100%. I think it's one of the most important skills in the game.
Identifying opponents' decks, the early games of Marvel Snap, so dang important. So I'm going to go ahead and throw you a couple of cards you might see on turn 1 and 2, and you tell me what deck you think they're going to play. And this is going to be good for you guys, too, to kind of pick up on it. Now, there are some card combinations that are just hot 1 and 2s, right? And so you're not going to always know what they're trying to do. But Alex, we'll start you out with an easy one here, okay? Turn 1 is an Ant-Man, okay? And turn 2 is a Mojo.
That would strike me as a ongoing Wong Spectrum list. Possibly ongoing Destroyer.
Yeah, okay, exactly. But see how easy you were able to make that connection? And I'm curious if our viewers will be able to do this as we kind of go through each one, right? So this one's a little bit tougher, but what about an Iceman Scorpion?
That's an FU deck archetype.
I was waiting for that. Just value cards, right, man? Just like
yeah,
good.
It's good cards. Yeah, it's the good card archetype.
And that one's a little bit tougher. I think Sunspot, you guys are going to see very common. And if you see Sunspot, it's you typically Sunspot, Scorpion, Iceman, Scorpion. You got to wait maybe till turn 3. You might see that Electro come in. There's almost always on turn 3, you'll know. You should know by turn 2, but by turn 3, you'll usually know. Discard Morbius decks, Alex, and why this is important. If you see a Morbius come out on turn 2, you know what you need to do the rest of the game. It's super obvious. What do they need to do is what you need to do. They're going to rely on that Morbius lane to win that lane, right? You can calculate and keep track of your opponent's hand size and how they're discarding and what they kind of have going on. And then you just need to focus on one other lane. Maybe you Cosmo a lane to make that MODOK a little bit tougher. It really tells you what you need to do. And then you use the locations as well to your advantage to kind of formulate a quick game plan, right? It's like mini game plans, and it's a lot to handle, but you get better at it over time for sure. All right, Alex, so here's another one for you, okay? Turn 1, they play Sunspot, okay? But turn 2, they play Sentinel. What kind of deck do you think they'd be playing?
That would strike me as a Sarah control list. But there's possible. Anytime you see Sentinel, Devil Dinosaur might just be around the corner, right? So
right? No, and that's good. And that's that's the answer, right? You know it's either Sarah Control, most likely, or Devil Dinosaur. And you kind of anticipate for those 2 decks. And how do you anticipate for those, right? You watch out for the one lane that they're going to be playing in. They're obviously going to just try to dominate one lane and kind of abandon it. And then you can also look out for Sarah Control signs, which means they're just going to try to get rid of your big cards, your ongoing cards early, right? And look out for those different things. If you're playing something like Morbius, it's probably going to get Enchantress at that point. So you probably need to have another game plan, and that's kind of the full focus. Okay, so that was a good one. And Alex, if we go through most of these, I think they're pretty obvious. Psylocke on turn 2, right? Nothing on turn 1, Psylocke on turn 2. What do we think it's going to come out? Probably Mr. Negative.
Especially when they snap.
Yeah, right. I know. Patriot decks, super obvious. Bucky and Carnage, you're going to see so often. Obviously, those are probably the easiest to prep for. You know exactly what's going on. And Alex, I think this kind of takes us to our next subject with the early game. You see Bucky, you see Carnage come right after it, right? You have your Destroy staple, big power lane. And Destroy decks want that lane, and they want one other lane in addition to that, right? So, Alex, my question with this is, when it comes to challenging a lane or when to abandon one and go for another location, this is a skill that I think people are still learning in Snap, and probably one of the more important ones, because oftentimes I see people either abandon the location too early, right? They assume what the opponent has, and they're like, I'm out. I can't do this lane. I'll go to another one. Or they stick into a lane too long. They don't know that sweet spot. Alex, what's something that you do with this, and how can people get better at knowing when to challenge and when to leave?
I think that one of the things that has really helped me is keeping a better track of like what's in my deck, what answers do I have available. Like if I know that I'm running a deck like, for instance, a Mr. Negative base list, I want to keep all options open, because if I draw a negative or inverted Iron Man Mystique, then no lane is out of reach. Right, so I want to make sure I leave that kind of space available. If they're using locations to their advantage, right, I want to make sure I have a Storm available to kind of knock that advantage away. Because if like they're playing a Colossus into a negative zone and that they're really banking on those cards and we can't really zoo into it, we'll knock it out and lower their advantage. Marvel Snap is such a complex game, and it's so hard to say like what is the one thing you can do. I think there's a million different things you can do, but I think the most important thing you can do is like just not give up. Like don't give up on a lane necessarily, but I think you're right. You don't want to commit to it either. I think that like there's a lot of lanes where people can, surprise themselves with how well they can reach into it. But at the same time, there is that gentle balance of like not overcommitting to something and then being completely and wildly underpowered everywhere else. And I guess the other thing worth mentioning is like, what kind of disruption do you have?
Yeah.
Do you have a Magneto that completely changes the landscape of the board that they won't be anticipating? Right? Do you have a Doctor Doom that's going to reach into locations that they're not anticipating?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think some decks are very early turn, like needed, and some decks are relying on their late turn, like Death Wave, right? But because Death Wave can spread so much power. But a great example is, let's say, the Destroyer, right? Destroyer decks rely on the one lane that they're setting up early with Ant-Man out the go. That's going to be like 20 plus power because they've got a lot of ongoing cards. And then 15 power in another. And so right away, you know exactly what you need to do. If they have an Ant-Man going down and maybe a Captain America, you either, one, challenge the heck out of that lane. You play your best cards in there, and they're not going to be able to beat you because you're going to be just focusing on that, and then you spread a little power in the other two lanes. Or number two is you just make sure that both of those other lanes are up at least by the Destroyer's amount, right? Or Spectrum's amount. And so there are certain decks that you can just know what their play patterns are. Again, we just said Morbius, right? You know how much power they're going to get on that Morbius, most likely. We're seeing a lot of 10 to 15s. Sometimes they play the MODOK into that. And you know that they are relying on getting that one location. And so sometimes challenging it is just looking at what the opponent is playing and knowing, do they have to win this location? Do you focus on two locations, Alex, or are you more of a wide location guy and you kind of like to play the more wide 3-location game?
Well, obviously, it really depends on the deck, right?
Yes.
Certain decks will favor going wide. For instance, if I'm playing my Electro Ramp list, I tend to contest pretty wide because I'm going to be using, Dr. Doom Odin, and that's just part of my strategy. It's part of what I like to do. But at the same time, I will have tools in my repertoire. Like I'm going to have Arrow to disrupt to help control and make sure that they can't play where they want to play. I'm going to have Magneto when I want to disrupt and put huge power on the board. I mean, so I guess there's different approaches, but I tend to believe that you only have to win 2 lanes in Marvel Snap. So sometimes it can be a fool's quest to try and win all 3, right, Cozy? Like you might just be putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I think that you got to be able to like determine like what your deck does well. Like a control list, if you're contesting all 3 lanes the whole time, like I think you're doing it wrong, right? Like you really want to be able to lock down one with that Professor X Daredevil when you can, and then put all the other resources into the other. You don't want to contest all 3, right? Yep. But with an Electro Ramp list or something like that, right? Maybe you can.
Yeah, and like looking at these cards, Alex, let's go through each one and you kind of tell me, like, again, if you see this, like, what do we think? Let's do it together. Like, if you see this, what do we expect? You know, Squirrel Girl, right? You see her, I don't know about you, but it's immediately death, or it's gonna a death deck with Killmonger, or you're gonna see Patriot, or you're gonna see Zoo. I think those are the options as far as Squirrel Girl, right? What about a card like I mean, back in the past, Korg was kind of more of a Dark Hawk. So we have things like Nightcrawler that you might see. People are starting to dip into that more. Alex, Quinjet, right? I see a Quinjet and I check their deck size. I'm like, is it Thanos? Is it probably Devil Dinosaur, right? Is what I think. And so going through like these one-cost cards, what about Yondu? He's an interesting one.
When I see Yondu, I think it's a death wave list for sure. Because like obviously the Yondu hit counts towards the death count. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion as a community that Yondu isn't actually a disruption card. Despite it hitting an important piece every once in a while, it is definitely like a death wave style card that really helps to get death out for free when you're counting on it most.
Yeah, and more we're seeing null decks too with Yondu. Adam Warlock, what deck do you think of? It's the same one every time for me.
For me, when I see Adam Warlock, I think it's Bass negative.
Oh, see, I'll go Galactus, 100%. I think, no question,
Really?
I'm going to see a Galactus deck. Yeah, that's interesting, though. I like this because you see different things than I do, right? And that just makes it more, I think, overall interesting. What about Angela? I think that one's pretty easy.
When I see Angela, I think it's Mr. Negative or Bounce.
Yeah, Bounce, okay, I like it. For me, Angela, I immediately go Sarah Control. Like, that's kind of like my go-to there. But I also like the Mr. Negative. I do know people played in there. Black Widow.
Oh, Darkhawk for sure.
Darkhawk or Disruptive, yeah, 100%. And I think both, Disruptive, by the next turn because you get the debris or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
What about something like Goose?
When I see Goose,
I think of one.
I mean, you see Goose on occasion in negative decks just because they can slide under and no one else can really contest them effectively. You often see it as well in ongoing base like Spectrum Wong list, because it's a very cheap +2 that can be hit. But other than that, like Cozy, is there another deck list I'm forgetting about here with
Cerebro 2? I almost exclusively think is a gooser. A lot of Goose in Cerebro 2. When I see Goose, or if I see obviously like Mr. Sinister, I think Patriot or Cerebro 2 as well. Those are kind of more like, okay, I know what I'm going up against. So outside of just the cards, Alex, again, this whole kind of subject is based about seeing what deck they're playing, looking at the locations and which ones are going to favor, yourself, and then like what your mini game plan is, right? Create a very quick and concise game plan on how you think you're going to win. And this goes into turn 5 and 6. Again, I'll bring up, I was going up against the Sarah Control deck. My Sunspot was 10. I think he thought I was going to double down on that Sunspot lane. I abandoned it completely, and I went to another lane altogether because I knew the Killmonger was coming, and I got an 8-cube win. So, like, looking for what your opponent is thinking you're going to do and then anticipating is vital to your success, Alex. For our last subject, Alex, we have Archetype Card MVPs. And so this is going to be what cards in each archetype are the most vital. And if you're building a deck shell around it, you kind of have to include it, right? So again, going bit by bit here, starting with, let's say, ongoing. What would be your ongoing MVP or the card that you think needs to be an ongoing list if you're running it?
So on my list here, I have it written down. I think the ongoing MVP is Iron Man.
Yes. Okay.
Not
not
just for ongoing list, but just as like a representative for ongoing cards that can fit in almost any deck.
Yeah. No. You know what? I thought you were gonna pick, because I do think there's a battle between Spectrum and Onslaught. I think that's important to address here. But at the same time, I was looking through all of them, and I thought the same thing. I thought Iron Man is like the ongoing representation of an MVP. You can put him in any deck, and he's gonna be competitive.
Yeah. Talk about like kind of like winning lanes and kind of like committing to lanes. You can play an Iron Man into a lane that like you're just barely winning, and not play there again because your opponent's like, no, I can't contest there.
Right?
There's a mind game with Iron Man. He's so good.
A Maximus is 14 power on an Iron Man lane, and it's so hard to beat that. And then you can't freaking Shang-Chi it because it's not big enough in power. They're super hard, and he's just a tough guy to kind of contend with in general because of all that power, kind of like a claw lane. When it comes to Spectrum Onslaught, I think Onslaught is kind of slept on. I know we'll talk about that. I don't think I have him as a card that's slept on too much, but I'm getting a lot more value out of Onslaught. Like I've been doing Wave. You can do Wave Sarah Onslaught or Wave Onslaught Sarah, and then on turn 6, you get a massive discount to all of your cards. I think Onslaught is also a pretty damn good card for ongoing.
I recently actually featured Onslaught in a list for a Pool 3 exclusive Patriot list. And people were surprised. They're like, Onslaught, really? That's not in the most Patriot list. I'm like, guys, Onslaught gives you a secondary win condition. You know, when you don't draw your Ultron, everything else just becomes even bigger with your Blue Marvel and your Khazar and everything else. Like, I was running Squirrel on the list as well, which is valuable with Debris. So like you kind of filled the board so fast. And honestly, Onslaught was so good. It won me games. And obviously, like, if you're playing Patriot, like, I think Ultron is better. Yep. But sometimes you need a secondary condition, and I think that Onslaught is often that.
Let's go to something like Move. I think this is going to be a bit tougher. Pick one MVP for the Move archetype.
Okay, for me, Move, I think the MVP is Multiple Man, because Multiple Man is one of those cards that, like, Move has a hard time kind of really putting a ton of power on the board. You can't rely on Human Torch. Human Torch is a 1-drop, is like the worst. It might be... It's like one of the worst, I don't want to say worst design cards in the game, but like Killmonger just deletes the entire game. Like it's so rough to have a 1-cost Human Torch. So like Multiple Man as a 2 is immune to that, but also can be hit with the Hulkbuster. Every time it moves, it replicates. And I think the other thing it does is it gives, I know you love mind games, it makes calculating a final turn against move decks very hard.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're someone who practices move decks a lot and you're used to the Multiple Man going boom, 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 bouncing all over the place, then it could be used to your advantage as your opponent's like, man, I don't even want to do the math. It's only 4 cubes or whatever.
Right. Yep. The move decks are so mind gaming in general. You know, I think a lot of people are going to want us to say Heimdall. I don't think he is the MVP just because he's a bit too obvious. If we get another 6-drop that, I don't know, moves them all to the right, whatever, which would be so fun for head games. Like, which one does he have? Yeah. You know, maybe then. For me personally, Kraven's great and all. I think Vulture is probably the representation of move decks for me, as just far as like consistent value, that no matter what kind of shell you're building with a move deck, he might be the greatest. I wanted to put Iron Fist as I mentioned too, because he lets you move a card for only 1 cost. And I think that's super underrated as far as the later turns go, like turn 5, turn 6. But Vulture, man, this guy's out of his mind. He can get some insane value. I mean, just between Iron Fist and himself, dude, you're looking at a 3-cost 10, and it's super helpful. So that's move decks, buddy. Let's go on to discard. Give me your MVP for discard.
My MVP for discard, and I'm trying to hold back laughter, by the way, because like I love right in the middle of the screen during your move conversation, just like Cyclops sitting there for no freaking reason.
Let's move, X-Men.
Sitting there. Let's move, X-Men.
Yeah,
and the participation trophy for Cyclops for the move category.
Yeah.
So anyways, so with regards to discard, I'm gonna give a shout out to a card that I think no one really thinks about, but low key is the actual MVP of discard, and that's Lady Sif. Like Lady Sif, everyone talks about discard being like this RNG crazy, like, oh, I can't control anything. Lady Sif gives you the control that you crave in discard. It hits the Apocalypse when you want to hit the Apocalypse. It hits Death when you want to play Ghost Rider. This card is the most consistent. I mean, you could make an argument for Culling Wing too, but this specific card gives you so much added control in a deck list that is supposed to give you no control. And I think that, like, if you play discard, you kind of take for granted how good Lady Sif is, because it's the one time you don't have to sweat about playing a discard card. You just play it and it does what you want it to do. I think Lady Sif's an MVP.
I like it, dude. I like it. I actually took a look at her and I was like, is this potentially the one I would nominate? So, you know, Dracula, we're going to discount on this one because he's kind of that one last turn. He's clearly just such a good option to throw into like the majority, I would say. So I'll leave him off. You know, it was funny. Lady Sif was one. Calling Wing to me is probably the one that wins now. Because I'll tell you this, guys, people don't think about the value that Calling Wing does. If you have a Morbius on the board and you play Calling Wing on 3-ish, which you probably should around that time, you're getting, or you could play her on 2 and she's still going to get this value. If she discards Wolverine, Wolverine's now 4, she's 4 power, that's 8, Morbius gets 2. That is a 2/10 play on turn 2, which is, in my opinion, so huge. And like opposed to Lady Sif, like Lady Sif, you need to make sure you can maybe get Ghost Rider in there or even the Apocalypse, you know, late play, which is good as well. I feel like Colleen gets it all done in one swoop. And then if it's not Wolverine, you get 2 swarms worth 0/3. So that's 6 costs in total. Calling Wing has 4. That's still 10. And then Morbius is going to be 2. So that's 12 freaking power for 2 energy. And so right now, because of the Wolverine rework and Swarm fitting in, she might be my MVP of discard. All right, next category, Alex. Let's go and move to Destroy. I think Destroy is interesting. There's a lot of options on this one. What is your MVP for Destroy?
I got to go with my my top 10 card that I chose, is Killmonger. I think Killmonger is one of the MVPs. It's a great counter card. It also activates decks for you. Like, it does everything. It gives you an option against their deck, but it helps your deck, right? So it's a great card. I think Killmonger is one of those cards that, like, I mean, I think is fantastic. It was top 10 for me. But
so do you put him in all of your destroy lists, right? Because that's like what the MVP would do.
do I put him in all my destroy lists? You know, that's a good question, and I would say no.
Okay.
I would say no, I don't put him in all my destroy lists. So that's a good point. That's a good point. Never thought of it that way.
Which is
destroy stuff, though.
Which is why I have Carnage. I think Carnage is the MVP of destroy. Because with him, more than all of your other cards, you want to be sure what lane you're going to put him in. Number one, right? He gets rid of trash on the field and it gives you bonus, you know, opposed to like Venom. But I think Carnage is almost always good value, regardless when you play him. I can't remember building a destroy deck without Carnage. I'm starting to even sometimes leave out Bucky, but Carnage is always the staple. In fact, when I like start a fresh build, I like put Carnage in it, usually Bucky, and I'm like, all right, let's start from here. So that's why I have him up there. Killmonger's great, Venom's great, Death, right? It's like, how do we not say Death? But then you have to start combining a bunch of cards together. I think that it's Carnage and then probably Death on my list.
You converted me. I think you're right. I think Carnage is a much clearer winner here, MVP wise, than Killmonger. Because I didn't consider for a second that, like, you don't really use Killmonger all that much in very specific destroy lists, whereas Carnage is in every single one of them. Like, you can't make a destroy list without Carnage, kind of. Right. I agree with your take here.
Okay,
I'm right. No, you're right. I'm wrong.
No, I mean it's just a card I think is one that I have to put in most of my lists. Honor Reveal I think might be the toughest, Alex, as far as just there's so many in here. But if you were to pick like one card that like represents On Reveal as your MVP list, who do you got?
I can't believe you said it was hard. For me, it was the first one I did. I didn't even look at the list. I just put one card down, and that was Odin.
Okay. Yep. Odin was on mine. I have one other card. Why Odin to you? Just obvious.
Yes, it's like, hey, you're a good On Reveal card. Why don't you do it again?
Right. Yeah, you know, I think On Reveal is such a weird faction, Alex, because it's the least synergized in the sense of like you just do all on reveal effects, right? Because there's always some catch in there. You've got Lockjaw, you've got like they work in so much, and because on reveal, you know, spans across multiple archetypes, it's tough for it to pin down as one itself. Yeah, Odin I think is a clear, like, obviously he's gonna re-trigger those effects so well. I think Doctor Doom too is just tough not to put in there as just like a staple on reveal card that, you know, you can't get enough of. And again, like Arrow, it's like, it's a great card, but I don't know if that represents on reveal, whereas I feel like Odin and Doctor Doom do, right?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, I keep liking your answers better. Like, I do love Doctor Doom. He's probably one of my favorite cards in the game. But I'm sticking with Odin. Odin's still a good call. What about Thor, dude? I think Thor is also just so good. Like, man, the guy's always got value. Oh, what has he got? Ladies and gentlemen, audio listeners, he's got Thor's hammer himself. Alex, are you worthy? You're picking that up pretty easily. I mean, it's pretty light. I gotta be honest with you. I don't think it was made all that.
Not made in Asgard.
No, it's not made in Asgard. So I was able to pick it up with relative ease.
As Hella would say, a cheap replica, right? But
yeah, that's exactly what I am.
Those are going to be the card-specific MVPs, the ones that, you know, when you're building a deck, you probably should just include those in there. Guys, we have a lot of things cooking up for the Snapchat, a lot of things behind the scenes that we're excited to start revealing here pretty soon. And again, guys, if you want to go and catch all of the other subjects on Alex's channel, we're going to be breaking those down. You can find that down in the link below. And a huge thank you, as always, guys. Great reviews, amazing comments. Let us know down below or in the podcast reviews what subjects you guys would like for us to talk about next. And guys, until the next one, have a good one and happy snapping.